Ben Carter squeezed the cleaning cloth one more time and reached up to wipe the massive window. His reflection stared back at him from the crystal clear surface, a tired human in a gray uniform that had seen better days. Below him, the Imperial docking bay stretched out like a jeweled canyon, all gleaming metal and polished stone. Dragons flew in precise formations, practicing their positions for the ceremony that would happen in just a few hours. The cloth caught on something. Ben stopped and looked closer. A hairline crack ran through the thick crystal, barely visible unless he knew what to look for. He had been cleaning windows on the dragon home world of Scarathus for 3 years now, and he knew this crack had not been there yesterday. "Hey, Quillick," Ben called out to his supervisor. The bird-like alien glanced up from his data pad, feathers ruffling with annoyance. "What is it now, Carter?" "There's a crack in observation window 7 right above where the prince will be landing. Should I report to maintenance?" Quillick made a dismissive clicking sound with his beak. "The ceremony starts in 4 hours. Nobody cares about a tiny crack. Just clean around it and move on." Ben looked down at the landing platform again. Hundreds of dragons would be gathering there soon, along with ambassadors from a dozen different species. If that crack spread during the ceremony, if the window shattered and fell, people could die. "I need to fix it," Ben said quietly. "You need to finish your assigned work." Quillick snapped. "The Crown Prince is returning after 5 years away. Every surface in this bay needs to shine. I don't have time for you to play engineer." Ben had heard that tone before. It was the same tone people used when they wanted to remind him that he was just a janitor, just a human taking up space in a galaxy that barely noticed his species existed. He had dropped out of engineering school when his sister got sick, spent every credit he had on her treatment, and ended up here with a mop and a bucket instead of a degree. But he still remembered how to read structural stress patterns. "I'll work through my break," Ben offered. "I can seal it with bonding resin from the maintenance closet. 30 minutes tops." Quillick sighed with his whole body. "Fina, but if you're not done when the dignitaries start arriving, I'm writing you up." And Carter, "Stay out of sight. The dragons don't like seeing humans during important events." Ben nodded and headed for the supply closet. He knew exactly which dragons Quillick meant. The old ones, the ones who remembered when humans were still confined to their single planet, struggling to build their first crude starships, to dragons who lived for thousands of years. Humans were barely a blip, temporary, forgettable. That he gathered his supplies and returned to the window. The bay below was transforming. Dragons and ceremonial armor took their positions. Officials hung banners that shimmered with captured starlight. Musicians tested instruments that produced sounds too deep for human ears to fully register. Ben activated a safety harness and carefully applied the bonding resin along the crack. The material was designed for emergency hull repairs, strong enough to hold a spaceship together during faster-than-light travel. It would definitely handle a window. While he worked, he could hear the nobles below talking. Dragon voices carried well, deep and resonant. 5 years among the lesser species, one dragon said, her golden scales catching the light. "I wonder what Prince Asherin learned out there." "Nothing useful, I'd wager," another responded, his voice thick with contempt. "My nephew toured Those same worlds, said the prince, spent more time with humans and other soft species than with proper dignitaries. Even taught classes to common hatchlings, if you can believe it. Disgraceful. Emperor Tormund must be disappointed. Ben tried not to listen, but it was impossible not to hear. He focused on his work, making sure the seal was perfect. The resin hardened quickly under the UV light. He swept across it. In 20 minutes the window was sound again, though he was packing up his supplies when horns blared across the bay. The prince's ship was arriving early. Ben froze on his platform, suddenly very aware that he was still visible in the window. He should have been gone already. Quillick was going to kill him. The ship descended with grace that only dragon pilots could achieve. It was sleek and elegant, copper-colored metal that seemed to glow from within. The landing struts touched down without even the whisper of sound. The bay doors opened. Dragons bowed. Ambassadors straightened in their ranks. Prince Asherin emerged. He was smaller than Ben expected for a dragon. His copper scales caught the light in waves as he moved, and he walked instead of flying down the ramp. That seemed unusual based on what Ben had observed over the years. Dragons almost always flew when they could, especially during ceremonies. Ben tried to stay still, hoping nobody would look up and see the human janitor interrupting the moment. But as Prince Asherin reached the bottom of the ramp, as he was supposed to bow to the assembled nobles, something strange happened. The prince looked up, his eyes deep amber with flecks of gold, locked directly onto Ben through the crystal window. For just a moment everything else seemed to fade. Ben saw something in those eyes that he recognized because he had seen it in his own mirror for years. Exhaustion, loneliness, the particular kind of tired that comes from pretending to be fine when you're not. Then the moment passed. Prince Asherin looked away, bowed to the proper people, and began the formal greetings that protocol demanded. Ben quickly gathered his equipment and headed for the service elevator. His hand was shaking slightly, though he could not explain why. It had just been eye contact, nothing more. The prince had probably been looking at the window, checking his own reflection, and had not even noticed the human cleaning crew member beyond the glass. But as Ben rode the elevator down to the maintenance level, he could not shake the feeling that something important had just happened. Something he did not understand. Why? ETI in his pocket, his communicator buzzed. A message from Quillick: get to corridor maintenance immediately. The ceremony is moving to the throne hall and every passage needs to be spotless. Ben sighed and headed for his supply cart. Just another day of being invisible in a palace full of dragons. He had no idea that in a few hours everything would change. The throne hall of flames lived up to its name. Rivers of molten rock flowed through channels carved into the black stone floor, providing both light and heat. Ben stayed in the side corridor, well away from the main chamber where hundreds of dragons had gathered. His job was simple: keep the passage clear and be ready to handle any messes that might occur during the ceremony. Through the massive archway, he could see Emperor Tormund seated on a throne that seemed to be carved from a single piece of volcanic glass. The emperor was ancient beyond human comprehension, his golden scales dimmed slightly with age but still radiating power. When he spoke, the entire hall fell silent. My son returns to us after His journey among the stars, Emperor Tormund announced he has seen the lesser species in their natural habitats. He has observed their ways and their weaknesses. Now he comes home to prepare for his destiny to one day rule the greatest empire the galaxy has ever known. The dragons roared their approval, the sound vibrating through the stone floor and into Ben's bones. Prince Asherin entered the hall. He still walked instead of flying, his copper scales seeming dull compared to the brilliance around him. He bowed to his father with perfect form, but Ben noticed something. The prince's movements were correct but hollow, like someone going through motions they had practiced 1,000 times without meaning. Father, Asherin said, his voice carrying clearly despite not being particularly loud, I returned to fulfill my duty. And what have you learned, my son? Emperor Tormund asked. Ben knew he should leave. This was not a conversation for a human janitor to overhear, but something kept him there. Watching from the shadows, I have learned that the galaxy is vast, Asherin said carefully, that many species exist, each with their own ways. I have seen both strength and weakness in all of them. It was a perfect diplomatic answer. It said everything and nothing at the same time. Emperor Tormund nodded, seeming satisfied. Then let us proceed with the ceremony of homecoming. That was when a young dragon burst into the hall. She was small, barely bigger than a human, with bright red scales that practically glowed with youth. She could not have been more than 20 years old, which for dragons meant she was essentially a child. Teacher, she cried out, her voice high and excited. Teacher, you came back. The hall erupted in shocked murmurs. Dragons did not interrupt imperial ceremonies ever. The young dragon, apparently named Pith, based on what the scandalized nobles were whispering, ran straight toward Prince Asherin with complete disregard for protocol. 2 guards moved to intercept her, but Asherin held up a claw to stop them. Perith, he said gently, you should not be here, but you promised you would come back. Pith said, her eyes wide. You promised you would finish teaching us about the binary star systems. Emperor Tormund's expression darkened. Teaching, Asherin? What is this hatchling talking about? Before the prince could answer, Quillick appeared at Ben's elbow, moving with surprising speed for a bird-like creature. Carter, we need, damn it. Control, Quillick hissed. Get that hatchling out of the hall before she causes more trouble. Just guide her gently to the side entrance. Vin wanted to argue that he was a janitor, not a handler of young dragons, but Quillick was already pushing him forward, and refusing would probably cost him his job. He approached Perth carefully, keeping his posture non-threatening. Hey there, he said softly. I know you're excited to see the prince, but we need to let him finish the ceremony. How about we wait outside? PTH looked at him with confusion. You're a human. Yeah, I am, teacher. Said humans were kind. He said you help others even when nobody asks you to. Ben blinked. He glanced up at Prince Asherin and found those amber eyes locked on him. Again, this time the prince's expression was easier to read, recognition and something that looked almost like panic. The moment stretched too long. Emperor Tormund noticed the exchange. Asherin. The Emperor said slowly, do you know this human? Ben felt his heart hammering. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew it was not good. Dragons did not acknowledge humans. Princes certainly did not stare at janitors like they had seen a ghost. Asherin started, then stopped. his scales shimmered a sign of emotional distress. In dragons, I do not, but his voice lacked conviction. Emperor Tormund stood from his throne, and the temperature in the hall seemed to drop despite the flowing lava. Everyone out now except my son and the human. The nobles fled with impressive speed. Even the guards withdrew to the outer corridors. Perth looked frightened, but Ben gently guided her toward the exit. "It will be okay," he whispered to her, though he had no idea if that was true. Within minutes the massive hall was empty except for three beings: an ancient emperor, a confused prince, and a janitor who desperately wanted to be anywhere else. "Explain," Emperor Tormund commanded. Asherin looked at Ben, really looked at him, and Ben suddenly remembered. It hit him like a physical blowpint 5 years ago. Haven's rest station, the decompression event that he had stayed behind to seal the bulkheads manually when the automated systems failed. He had worked for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, making sure everyone evacuated safely. One of the people he had saved was a young dragon traveling alone, wearing simple clothes and asking thoughtful questions about engineering and life and purpose. They had talked for hours while Ben worked, about loneliness, about duty, about what it meant to matter in a huge and different universe. Ben had never known that dragon's name, had never asked. The dragon had seemed like just another traveler, someone passing through. "It's you," Ben said quietly. Asherin closed his eyes. "It's me." Emperor Tormund looked between them, his expression unreadable. "Someone," he said, in a voice like distant thunder, "is going to explain to me exactly what is going on, and they're going to do it right now." Ben felt a small, warm object being pressed into his palm. He looked down to see a crystal scale, copper colored and glowing faintly, a calling card, a promise. He looked up at Prince Asherin, who gave the smallest nod. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. 3 days had passed since the ceremony, and Ben still had his job. Barely. Emperor Tormund had dismissed him from the throne hall without explanation, and Asherin had been confined to the royal wing for debriefing. Ben had not heard anything since. Now he was in the royal archives at midnight, pushing his cleaning cart through rows of ancient books and data. Crystal, the archive was enormous, filled with 50,000 years of dragon history. Most nights Ben loved this assignment: the silence, the smell of old paper, the sense of being surrounded by stories. Tonight he just felt tired. "Hello, Ben." Ben nearly knocked over his bucket. Prince Asherin stood in the shadows between 2 massive bookcases, wearing simple robes instead of royal armor, without the formal regalia. He looked younger, less intimidating, more like the dragon Ben had talked to on Haven's rest station all those years ago. "Your Highness," Ben stammered, bowing awkwardly. "I didn't. You shouldn't be here. Neither should you technically. The archives close to staff at sunset." Asherin stepped forward into the light. "But I'm glad you are. I wasn't sure you would remember me from before." Ben sat down his cleaning supplies with shaking hands. "How could I forget? You stayed with me for 3 days while we fixed that station. We talked about everything. You never told me you were a prince. Would you have talked to me the same way if you had known?" Ben thought about that. "No, probably not exactly." Asherin moved to one of the reading tables and sat on the floor beside it, gesturing for Ben to join him. "That's why I didn't tell you. For 3 days I was just me, not the heir, not the future emperor, just Someone trying to figure out what mattered. Ben sat down across from him, feeling strange about sitting on the floor with royalty. Did you figure it out? Not then, but those conversations stayed with me. Every world I visited, every species I met, I kept thinking about what you said, about how every job matters when you do it with intention, about how home is not a place but a feeling of being understood. They sat in silence for a moment. The archives were so quiet, Ben could hear his own heartbeat. Why did you come back? Ben finally asked Ascarethus. I mean, you seem happier out there teaching hatchlings like pith, meeting new people. Asheron's scales dimmed slightly. Duty. My father expects me to take the throne. Within a decade, the empire needs stability, and I'm the only heir. You don't sound excited about it. I'm terrified, Asheron admitted. The honesty in his voice was startling. Ben, I've seen how other civilizations work. Species that adapt quickly, that embrace change, that listen to new ideas, regardless of who speaks them. Then I come home and the Council of Elders spend 6 hours debating whether we should update a trade agreement that's been unchanged for 3,000 years. Ben understood that frustration more than Asheron probably realized. So change it. You'll be emperor. It's not that simple. Dragon culture is built on tradition. We've maintained the same basic structure for 50,000 years. The elders will say that's proof it works. They'll never accept ideas from, he trailed off, from a human. Ben finished, from anyone they consider lesser, which is everyone who is not a dragon. Asheron looked directly at him. But you saved 200 lives. On that station, you stayed behind when everyone else evacuated. You worked yourself to exhaustion to seal those bulkheads manually, and the whole time, you never once acted like it was heroic. You just said it was your job. It was my job. That's my point, Asheron said, his voice rising with passion. Dragons would have made it into a story of individual glory. Humans just do what needs doing. You see problems and fix them, not because it will bring you honor, but because leaving them broken would be wrong. Ben thought about the cracked window he had repaired before the ceremony. Quillic had told him to ignore it, but Ben had fixed it anyway, not for recognition, just because it was dangerous. Your father asked me what we talked about, Ben said carefully. I didn't know what to tell him. What did you say? That we talked about ideas, about making things better. Ben pulled the copper scale from his pocket. He had been carrying it since the ceremony. He didn't seem happy. Asheron laughed, but it was not a happy sound. My father sees the universe in very simple terms. Dragons are superior. Everyone else exists to serve or be conquered. The idea that I might have learned something valuable from a human janitor that would shatter his entire worldview. I'm not trying to shatter anything, Ben said. I just clean floors and fix things. You do more than that. You listen, you think, you care about people you'll never meet, like those 200 souls on the station. Asheron stood and walked to the window, looking out at the volcanic mountains. I spent 5 years watching humans build communities based on cooperation. I saw species working together, sharing ideas, adapting to new challenges. Then I come home and my father tells me that's weakness. Ben joined him at the window. Is it? No, it's the opposite, but convincing the Council of Elders. Asheron shook his head. They'll never listen to me. I'm young by dragon standards. What do I know? You know what You've seen what you've learned from species they consider inferior. They stood in silence watching the stars. Above the mountains, can I ask you something? Ben said quietly. Anything. Why did you look at me like that during the ceremony, like you were scared? Asherin was quiet for a long moment. Because in that instant I had to choose between pretending I didn't know you and being honest, and I realized I was tired of pretending, tired of acting like the only things worth knowing come from dragons who have never left this planet. He turned to face Ben directly. You asked why I came to find you tonight. The truth is I've been thinking about those 3 days on Haven's rest station. Constantly for 5 years, I search for that feeling again. That sense of being understood, of talking to someone who saw me as a person instead of crown, and when I saw you in that window, it all came back. Ben didn't know what to say. He was a janitor, a college dropout, someone who had spent the last 3 years being invisible. I don't have answers. He finally said, I don't know how to fix an empire, maybe not, but you know how to fix what's broken. And Ben Asherin's expression softened. This empire is very, very broken. The archive bell chimed softly, signaling the approach of dawn. I should go, Asherin said reluctantly, but can we meet again, talk more? Ben thought about his job, his safety, all the sensible reasons to say no. Yeah, he said, we can. Asherin smiled, the first genuine smile Ben had seen on him since his return. Thank you, the prince said, for remembering, for not treating me like I'm made of glass and glory. He left through a hidden door Ben hadn't known existed. Ben stood alone in the archives, holding the copper scale, and wondered what he had just gotten himself into. 2 weeks had changed everything. Ben and Asherin met in different hidden corners of the palace, abandoned observatories, forgotten garden, storage rooms filled with old ceremonial equipment. They talked about problems facing the empire, and Ben offered solutions based on simple human logic. Fix the foundation before worrying about the decorations. Listen to people who do the actual work. Try small changes before massive reforms. Asherin had started smiling again. His scales were brighter. He walked with more energy. Someone had noticed. Ben was replacing burned out light panels in the eastern corridor. When the guards came for him, they didn't speak, just gestured for him to follow. His heart sank. This was it. Whatever fragile permission he'd had to exist in the palace was over. They brought him to the council chamber, a circular room with 12 seats arranged in a semicircle. In each seat sat an ancient dragon, their scales bearing the patina of age and power. In the center seat, larger than the others, Emperor Tormund watched Ben with unreadable eyes. Human, the Emperor said. Step forward. Ben walked to the center of the room, very aware of how small he was compared to the beings surrounding him. His cleaning uniform suddenly felt even shabbier than usual. You have been meeting with my son, Tormund stated, not a question. Ben considered lying. Dismissed the idea immediately. Yes, Your Majesty, a silver dragon too. Tormund's left spoke. Her name was Isadora, and Ben had heard she was one of the oldest members of the council. What do you discuss in these meetings? Ideas, Ben said simply. Ways to solve problems. What problems? Tormund asked. Whatever the prince brings to me, colony issues, trade disputes, questions about other species. A massive bronze dragon named Hrothgar leaned forward. And you, Janitor presumed to advise the future. Emperor, I don't presume anything, Ben said, keeping his voice steady. He asked questions I answer honestly, that's all. Isidora's eyes narrowed. Thoughtfully, the prince has been different since your meetings began. More confident, almost happy. Is that crime? Ben asked, then immediately regretted his tone, surprisingly. Isidora's mouth curved in what might have been a smile. No, but it is curious. Emperor Tormund stood, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. You claim to have wisdom to offer my son. Very well, prove it. He gestured, and a holographic display appeared in the center of the room. It showed a planet, mostly desert, with scattered settlements. This is Coral 7, one of our colony worlds, 2 million inhabitants, mostly dragons with some mixed species populations. For the past year they have been experiencing a severe drought. Our weather control systems have failed. Traditional solutions require evacuating the entire population and abandoning the colony. The cost would be catastrophic, both financially and politically. Tormund fixed Ben with a hard stare. You have 1 day to propose an alternative. Human, if you succeed, I will consider that your advice to my son has merit. If you fail, you will leave Skorathis and never contact Asheron again. Do you accept these terms? Ben's mouth went dry. He was a janitor, not a planetary engineer, but he looked at the hologram, at the dying world, at the 2 million people who would lose their homes. I'll need access to your environmental data and engineering specifications, he said. Several of the council members hissed in shock at his audacity. You didn't make demands of the Emperor, but Tormund just nodded. Granted, you have until tomorrow. At sunset, they gave him a small office with a data terminal. Ben had not slept. He had barely eaten. For 20 hours he pored over sensor readings, geological surveys, and system diagnostics. His eyes burned, his head pounded, but gradually a picture emerged. The problem was not the drought itself. The problem was how the dragons had tried to fix it. Dragon technology was incredible. It could control weather patterns with precision, terraform entire planets, move water from one hemisphere to another with perfect efficiency, but it all depended on massive centralized systems that required constant power and maintenance. When those systems failed on Coral 7, the dragons had tried to repair them. They had thrown more resources, more power, more sophisticated technology at the problem. It hadn't worked because the planet's magnetic field had shifted slightly, disrupting the control network. Synchronization. The dragon solution was to fix the systems or abandon the planet. Ben looked at the problem differently. What if they didn't need to fix the dragon technology? What if they use something simpler? He sketched out a plan using local materials, underground water collection systems that didn't require power, atmospheric moisture, harvesters based on temperature, differential, not computer control, decentralized irrigation networks that could be maintained by the colonists themselves. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't efficient by dragon standards. The systems would require constant manual adjustment, but it would work, and it would save the colony. Ben finished his proposal as the sun began to set outside the window. He had just enough time to clean himself up and make himself presentable before the council reconvened. He stood before them again, this time with his data pad in hand. Well, Emperor Tormund asked. Ben activated the holographic display, and Walked them through his plan. He expected interruptions, dismissals, mockery. Instead, the council was silent. When he finished, nobody spoke. For a long moment, finally Isadora leaned forward. This could work. It's inelegant and inefficient by our standards, but it would save the colony. It abandons our technology, Rothger protested. Reduces us to manual labor. Like primitive species, it saves 2 million lives, Ben said quietly. Isn't that worth more than elegance, Emperor? Tormund studied the hologram, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at Ben with something that might have been respect or might have been danger. You have proven your point, human. Your advice has value. He paused. But you have also proven something else. You are dangerous to the order we have maintained for 50,000 years. Ben felt his stomach drop. You think differently than we do, Tormund continued. You see solutions where we see only failure. You make the complex simple. He stood from his throne. My son has been learning from you, learning to question tradition, to embrace adaptation, to value ideas over ancestry. Is that wrong? Ben asked. I don't know yet, Tormund admitted, but I know this. Change is coming to this empire whether I like it or not, and you, Ben Carter, are standing at the center of it. The Emperor gestured to the guards. Implement his plan for Coral 7. If it works, we will discuss what happens next. As Ben left the council chamber, he found Asherin waiting in the corridor. Outside, I heard the prince said, that was incredibly brave. That was incredibly stupid, Ben corrected. Your father could have had me exiled, but he didn't. Don't you see? You made them think, maybe for the first time in centuries. Asherin's eyes were bright with hope. Things are changing, Ben. Finally changing. Ben wanted to share that optimism, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Emperor Tormund's words have been both a compliment and a warning. Dangerous to the order. The question was whether that danger would be allowed to grow or whether it would be eliminated before it could spread. 3 months had passed since Ben saved Coral 7. The colony was thriving with his simple systems, and Emperor Tormund had grudgingly promoted Ben to special consultant. The title meant nothing to most dragons, but gave Ben slightly better quarters and permission to attend certain planning sessions. That it also meant he had a clear view of the preparations for tomorrow's ceremony. Asherin's coronation. Ben stood in his new quarters holding the formal invitation that had been delivered that morning. The ceremony would be massive. Thousands of witnesses from across the empire. Asherin would officially become crown prince in full authority, one step away from the throne itself. That a knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Asherin entered without waiting for an answer, still a habit that made Ben nervous despite their friendship. You look terrible, Ben observed that. Asherin's scales were dim, his movements heavy. I couldn't sleep, nervous about the ceremony. Terrified, Asherin sat on the floor, his usual spot when they talked. Ben, do you know what happens during a dragon coronation? I've read about it. Lots of ritual, lots of tradition. Yes, but there's one part that Asherin trailed off, struggling with the words. The final ritual is called the severance. The new crown prince must prove they are self-sufficient, that they need no one. They publicly dismiss everyone who might influence them, advisors, tutors, friends. Ben's stomach dropped. Everyone who isn't dragon, nobility, and even some who are Asherin looked at him with miserable eyes. My father added your name to the list this morning. The words hung in the air between them. I understand, Ben said quietly. It's tradition. It's what you have to do. That's exactly what I told myself, Asherin said. I spent all night practicing how I would say the words, how I would formally dismiss you in front of thousands of witnesses, and every time I practiced, I felt like I was betraying everything I've learned over the past 5 years. You're not betraying anything. You're doing your duty. But what if duty is wrong? Asherin stood pacing the small room. What if 50,000 years of tradition is just 50,000 years of being too afraid to change? You've taught me that problems have solutions, Ben, but what's the solution when the problem is the entire structure of your society? Ben had no answer. He was a janitor who had accidentally become friends with a prince. He had no business solving empire-wide philosophical crisis. Do what you need to do tomorrow, Ben finally said. I'll understand, and when you're emperor you can make whatever changes you want, but you have to get there first. Asherin stop pacing. You would really be okay with this, with being dismissed in front of everyone? Number Ben admitted it would hurt, but I'd survive if that's not good enough. Asherin's voice was fierce. You deserve better than survival. You saved the colony. You helped me understand more about leadership than decades of formal education. And tomorrow I'm supposed to stand in front of the empire and declare that you mean nothing. I'm just a human. Stop saying that. Asherin's scales flared bright with emotion. You're my friend, the first real friend I've had in over a century, and I'm supposed to cut you loose like you're nothing because tradition demands it. They stood in silence outside the window. The palace was being decorated for tomorrow's ceremony. Banners hung from every tower. Dragons practiced their ceremonial flights. I don't know what to tell you, Ben said. I can't make this decision for you. I know. I just Asherin slumped it. I wanted you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, it won't be because I don't value what we have. It will be because I'm a coward who can't stand up to 50,000 years of dragons telling me how things should be done. After Asherin left, Ben sat alone in the dark. He thought about Haven's rest station, about the 3 days he spent talking to a lonely dragon who didn't know his own worth. He thought about the choices people make when they're afraid. Tomorrow would either be the beginning of something new or the end of something brief but important. Either way, Ben would have to watch it happen. Ceremony began at dawn. The throne hall was so crowded that Ben could barely see through the mass of wings and scales. He stood in the servants' section wearing his nicest uniform, which was still just a gray jumpsuit with a consultant patch poorly sewn on. Emperor Tormund presided over each ritual with ancient dignity. Asherin performed perfectly the trial of flames, where he walked through a curtain of fire, the oath of ancestors, reciting the names of 500 generations of dragon emperors, the crown of starlight placed on his head by Tormund himself. Then came the severance. Tormund announced it with grave formality. Let the crown prince sever all bonds that would diminish the throne. One by one, names were called. Advisors who had taught Asherin as a hatchling approached were formally dismissed and departed with bowed heads. It was clearly painful for everyone involved, but it was tradition. Then Tormund added one more name, Ben Carter, human consultant. the hall went silent, every eye turned to the servants section. Ben walked forward, his legs feeling like they were made of stone. He crossed the vast floor, aware of thousands of dragons watching a human approach their future emperor. He stopped at the prescribed distance and bowed. Ben Carter, Asheron said, his voice echoing in the silent hall. You have served this empire with dedication. This was it, the formal dismissal, the end of their friendship in front of everyone. I acknowledge your service, Asheron continued, and he stopped. The silence stretched. Ben looked up and saw Asheron staring at his father, then at the assembled nobles, then at Ben. No, Asheron said quietly. The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. What did you say? Emperor Tormund asked, his voice dangerous. I said no. Asheron's voice was stronger now. I will not dismiss Ben Carter. The hall erupted in chaos. Dragons roared in outrage. Nobles shouted protests. Guards moved forward, uncertain what to do. Through it all, Asheron stepped down from the throne platform. He walked past his father, past the council of elders, past the assembled nobility of the empire. He walked across the floor to where Ben stood frozen in shock, and in front of thousands of witnesses, Prince Asheron, crown prince of the Dragon Empire, embraced a human janitor. The hall fell completely silent. In that silence, a single voice spoke. Elder Isadora stood from her seat. Perhaps, she said clearly, traditions persist not because they are right, but because we are afraid to question them. Emperor Tormund looked at his son, at Ben, at the divided hall. For the first time in 1,000 years, the ancient emperor didn't know what to do, and the empire held its breath. The throne hall remained frozen. In the moment, thousands of dragons waiting to see what would happen next. Ben could feel Asheron's arms around him, the warmth of dragon scales, the trembling that suggested the prince was just as terrified as Ben felt. Emperor Tormund's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Asheron stepped back. Asheron released Ben, but did not move away. No, father, you would destroy 50,000 years of tradition for a human. I would honor someone who has shown me more about true leadership than tradition ever did. The hall split into factions instantly. Some dragons roared their approval, others hissed in outrage. A fight nearly broke out between two noble families before guards intervened. Tormund raised a claw and silence fell again. The emperor's power was absolute and everyone knew it. He could exile Asheron, strip him of his title, declare him unfit to rule. Explain yourself, Tormund commanded. Make me understand why you would risk everything. Asheron stood straight, his scales brightening with determination. Because I spent 5 years watching our empire fail, father, colony after colony, struggling while we cling to methods that don't work anymore. Species leaving our protection because we treat them as servants instead of partners. And when I came home, what did I find? A human janitor who solved in one day a problem our best engineers had failed to fix for a year. Hrothgar the bronze dragon stood. One success does not prove a pattern. Prince, you're right, Asheron agreed. So let me give you more examples. In the past 3 months, Ben has helped optimize our trade routes, suggested improvements to our communication networks, and identified 17 structural flaws in our administrative systems, all problems that our traditional approaches had missed. He's a janitor, another dragon protested. He's an engineer who life forced into janitorial work, Asherin corrected, and that's exactly my point. We've been so focused on rank and species and tradition that we ignore wisdom when it comes from unexpected places. Torment expression was unreadable, and you believe this one. Human is more valuable than the entirety of our ancestral knowledge, I believe. Asherin said carefully that our ancestral knowledge is powerful, but it's incomplete. The galaxy is changing faster than we are. Species that adapt survive, those that refuse to change become fossils. Dangerous words, my son. Necessary words. Asherin looked at the assembled dragons. I've seen human communities build incredible things. Through cooperation, I've watched them solve impossible problems by listening to anyone with a good idea, regardless of who they are, and I've learned that strength isn't about standing alone. It's about knowing when to accept help. Isadora spoke again from her seat. The prince makes valid points. Our colony on Coral 7 thrives because we listen to the humans' advice. Perhaps we should consider that wisdom has many sources. Madness, Rothgard growled. If we start taking advice from janitors and technicians, what's next? Letting them rule us? I'm not suggesting humans rule dragons, Asherin said. I'm suggesting we stop dismissing good ideas because of who speaks them. Emperor Tormund was silent for a long time. Every dragon in the hall waited, barely breathing. Finally the Emperor spoke. You put me in an impossible position, Asherin. If I allow this, I validate your rebellion against tradition. If I forbid it, I prove your point about our inflexibility. Then perhaps, Isadora said gently, we need a new path. Neither absolute tradition nor complete revolution, but something in between. Tormund looked at his old advisor, then at his son, then at Ben. Very well. Here's my judgment. The hall went absolutely silent. Asherin, you may keep your crown and your title, but you have 5 years to prove your methods work. I will remain as Emperor Regent, watching and evaluating. If the Empire strengthens under your approach, tradition will bend. If it weakens, you will abdicate and accept the old ways. Asherin nodded slowly. I accept those terms, and you, human. Tormund fixed Ben with a hard stare. You will serve as official advisor to the Crown Prince, the first non-dragon to hold such a position in our history. Your success or failure will determine if this experiment continues or ends. Ben found his voice. Understand, Your Majesty. I hope you do, because if you fail, you don't just lose a job, you prove that 50,000 years of tradition were right all along, and change becomes impossible. The weight of that responsibility nearly crushed Ben where he stood. Asherin changed the final coronation oath, adding words no dragon emperor had ever spoken. I swear to serve not just dragon kind, but all who call this empire home. I swear to learn from any who have wisdom to share and to lead with both strength and humility. Some dragons walked out, but more stayed. Curiosity overcoming outrage. 6 months passed like a blur. The empire began changing in small, careful ways. Advisory councils that included non-dragons, problem-solving sessions where anyone could contribute ideas regardless of rank. Young dragons like Pyth studying alongside humans and other species. That it was messy, it was uncomfortable, but it was working. Ben stood in the old observatory one evening looking at star charts with Asherin. The prince wore his crown now, but he still sat on the floor, When they talked, do you ever regret it? Ben asked that moment in the throne. Hall, Asherin, consider the question. Sometimes I'm terrified we'll fail and I'll have destroyed something ancient. For nothing, but then I remember how I felt before trying to rule according to rules that didn't fit anymore, at least. Now I'm afraid while moving forward, instead of afraid while standing still. That's very philosophical for someone who's supposed to be all about strength and dominance. I learned from a very wise janitor that strength comes in many forms. Ben Smith, I'm not a janitor anymore. You made me an advisor. Remember, you're still a janitor. Sometimes I saw you fixing that broken door panel yesterday. Old habits plus. I still think better when my hands are busy. A young dragon student entered the observatory, one of the first in the new integrated academy. She looked nervous. Excuse me, she said quietly, is it true that the crown prince really walked away from his coronation to hug janitor? Ben and Asherin exchanged glances. He didn't hug a janitor, Ben said gently. He chose to honor friendship over fear. That's different. And it's more important. The student's eyes widened. So anyone can make a difference, even someone like me. Ben looked at Asherin, now wearing the crown but still willing to learn. He thought about Coral 7 still thriving because someone had listened to a simple idea. He thought about all the small changes adding up to something bigger, especially someone like you. Ben said that's usually where the best changes start. The student smiled and left to return to her studies. Asherin stood and walked to the window. Below them, the palace was alive with activity, dragons and humans and dozens of other species working together, arguing, learning, building something new. Do you think we'll succeed? Asherin asked quietly. I think we're already succeeding, Ben said. We're trying. That's more than your empire has done in 50,000 years. Fair point. Asherin was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Ben, for not letting me dismiss you, for being stubborn enough to keep fixing things even when people told you not to. Someone has to keep you humble. Can't have you getting too comfortable. With that crown, they stood together. Dragon Prince and a human janitor who had somehow become friends, watching an empire learn a change. It wasn't easy. It wasn't perfect, but it was real and it was happening. And sometimes Ben thought that was